Well, the chair of the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal Siboniso Duma has defended his actions in walking up to the podium and taking away the microphone from the traditional Prime Minister to the Zulu King, Thulasizwe Buthelezi, on Saturday. Duma says Buthelezi was turning a government event into a campaigning event. The IFP says the actions showed Duma and the ANC have desecrated the Zulu monarchy. The king of the Zulu people, King Msizulu Kazwelithini, was himself at the event when the incident occurred. Mkhuleko Hlengwa is the spokesperson for the IFP. Mkhuleko, good afternoon to you. You've obviously seen what happened. How do you feel about the actions of Siboniso Duma here?
Well, it's regrettable that Mr. Duma would conduct himself in the manner that he did, but at the same time, it comes as no surprise as this has been a pattern of his, demonstrating that he is an egotist, he is a bully, and undermines any position of authority. If you look at his conduct since he became the leader of the ANC in this province of KwaZulu-Natal, and how he has treated the premier of KwaZulu-Natal, that's the first point. The second one is that Mr. Duma is on record publicly saying that he does not recognize the traditional prime minister as appointed by His Majesty King Msizulu Kazwelithini, and therefore we need no other reference for us to understand why he behaves in the manner that he does. Thirdly, the man is just uncultured in anything Zulu etiquette, in anything royal family. He would not dare, if he was a serious Zulu, have done what he did in the presence of His Majesty, and worst of all in the presence of his political principal, the President of the Republic and the President of the ANC. For him to then, towards the end of that function, to with almost hand in one pocket, hand over the mic to His Majesty with one hand, in what we in Amazulu would call uksohloloza, His Majesty, and say me in giving him the mic. The whole thing, as far as we see it, is a man who undermines completely the authority of His Majesty the King, because he needs to explain to the South African public that why he would not recognize a traditional prime minister appointed by His Majesty the King if he respects and honors His Majesty the King. The final point is this, and that in an interview that he had with Newzroom Afrika last night, he then stupidly says that they do not recognize the traditional prime minister because it's not in the constitution, forgetting that one, the whole issue of traditional leadership was a last-minute insertion into the constitution, which led, of course, to the IFP then actually contesting elections in 1994 with the promise and commitment that the issue around the powers, functions, and responsibilities and roles of the traditional leaders and the institution of traditional governance would be determined post the election. It's precisely why in December 2000, a cabinet committee chaired by the then Deputy President, Mr. Zuma, recommended that chapters 7 and 12 of the Constitution must be amended in order to provide clarity on the key issue of the roles, powers, functions, and responsibilities of traditional leaders, including that of the traditional prime minister. Therefore, of course, out of ignorance, he would not know that because he's a Johnny-come-lately in the issues around traditional leadership. So what he did on Saturday is tantamount, really, to undermining the whole institution of traditional leaders, Amabuto, Amakosi, and the South African public. It's not the kind of behavior you would expect from a person in a position of leadership and responsibility.
Okay, Mkhuleko, this might sound like a technical question, but it could be important. Do you believe Siboniso Duma was acting only for himself when he did that? You've been very clear to talk about him. Or do you believe he was acting for the ANC?
Well, it's a mixture of both. He was acting on his own self-aggrandisement project towards premiership and trying to demonstrate some sort of political authority. But on the same time, acting on behalf of the ANC, if you look at the fact that for the past 48 hours, they've not called out his behavior, which sought to undermine His Majesty the King and the President of the Republic. In fact, you will recall that at some point during that event, he was busting his chest saying that this is their government, uhulumeni unamandla, some sort of boast and brag, sort of entitling himself that he can do anything and everything that he wants. And so as far as we are concerned, this is a two-pronged kind of outlook, but it's one of an individual who's just, as far as any sensible South African can see, is in his behavior reckless and irresponsible.
Okay.
And that is why we are concerned. I think I must also hasten to say, Stephen, is that His Majesty the King had a briefing in the morning about with the President. And amongst others, his traditional Prime Minister was excluded from the program. And that tells you that even in terms of protocol, there's heightened ignorance. The king cannot rise to a podium without being presented by his prime minister. And I want to condemn the behavior, because it's not just the king who had to bear the brutal brunt of this onslaught. It's the traditional prime minister, it's Amakhosi, it's the president, but also the praise singer, a senior elder in Zulu society, who he summoned like an ice boy, and then later on berated him for making a correction on a statement of history that was wrong, that had been made by the premier. So the whole thing was riddled by Siboniso Duma, uncultured, ill-disciplined, irresponsible, and reckless. Start to finish.
Mkhuleko, I have let you speak for most of this. I do want to ask you, Duma says Buthelezi was about to use this event, a government event, to campaign, to make a political point. Now, I know you'll support the Prime Minister Buthelezi, but doesn't he have a duty to not use an event like this for political purposes?
No, he shouldn't actually politic at any government event, particularly in the position of being the traditional Prime Minister.
And wasn't he about to do that?
That's what I want to explain. So in the first instance, none of us have heard what the traditional Prime Minister was going to say, because he was stopped from saying it. But that's besides the point. The point is that we have engaged with the traditional Prime Minister to ask him, because we are being drawn into this from a political perspective. And the issues that he was going to raise had been sanctioned by His Majesty the King. But that is for him to explain, because there is ongoing, for those of us who are in this province and in certain quarters of engagement, ongoing attack towards His Majesty the King that is being driven by the provincial secretary of the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal. It is therefore the responsibility of the traditional Prime Minister to raise that, not for the benefit of the IFP. We certainly would not sanction that. We are doing pretty well on our own. We are winning by-elections. We are on a very solid campaign. But the issues that he was going to raise, and I'm sure that you will find opportunity to engage with him, all we are saying is that it is wrong for the IFP then at the tail end of this to be drawn into something that we've got nothing to do with. In fact, the people who were politicking at that event was the ANC. ANC T-shirts were being distributed there. The branding of the government so-called T-shirts was also ANC branding there as well. If you look at the visuals that were there, it was ANC people. We sent no people there. We passed no people there because it was a government event. So the accusation, as far as we are concerned, goes the other way, that the people politicking at that event was the ANC.
But that's not what the ANC says. The ANC says that 10 of its supporters were hurt, they say, by your members. They claim they were bussed in from a hostel at this event on Saturday.
One, there's no hostel in Zululand. Secondly, if they make that claim, have you as the media tested it, or you've taken it for what it is?
So
Why must they make it?
So you deny?
Why must they make a claim and not substantiate it? Because the burden of proof lies with he who alleges. But we fundamentally, as the IFP, reject that claim. We do not believe that our members are involved in that kind of violence. In fact, the ANC is trying to create a conducive of violence in KwaZulu-Natal because they stand to gain from it, because instability is going to render us an election that is problematic. We stand everything to gain from a peaceful and stable KwaZulu-Natal because we are in an onward march to growth and victory in this province. So actually the beneficiaries of this manufactured violence is the ANC. And I'll tell you why I say it's manufactured. I challenge the leadership of the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal to release to the South African public the recording of the meeting they had on the 2nd of March 2024, Zoom meeting, where they planned and hatched to disrupt IFP activities. You will recall that the statement issued yesterday by the ANC is dated the 11th of March because they had initially instructed the provincial government to hold yesterday's commemoration on the 10th of March to coincide with the IFP manifesto launch. When that was postponed to yesterday, they did not dare to check that their plans would be exposed and issued a pre-written statement of the 11th of March on the 17th of March. So as far as we know and information that we have, the ANC is responsible for what happened yesterday, including the violence, but I'm putting it to them. Release to the South African public the recording of the meeting that you had on the 2nd of March to disrupt IFP activities, including our manifesto launch of last week, the 10th of March. You will know then why what happened yesterday happened. We want to call for peace, for calm and stability in the province. We're calling on the law enforcement agencies to do everything necessary to ensure an election that is free and fair and free from fear. And we want every South African to exercise their right to vote in a conducive environment. Nobody stands to gain from violence except the ANC.
Mkhuleko Hlengwa, the view from the Inkatha Freedom Party. He speaks for them. Of course, the ANC interview, that Chloe Mgambi did with Siboniso Duma, representing the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal, available for you on YouTube. In